To take stock of the Indian economy, and shall I say a very candid stock of the Indian economy and the world that we live in, who better than Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramanian, who joins us right here on ET Now. Thank you very, very much for being with us. As a part of this 3 years of government, I've been interviewing a whole host of ministers, about half a dozen done till now and some 4 others lined up. I'm going to take a breather from what I have done, and I'll ask you a very candid question, because you made this war cry for candid assessment. Over the next 25 minutes, let's be candid about what hasn't happened in the last 3 years, what could have been done, what needs to be done, because I think a lot of print and airtime will be spent on bloating, and let the ministers do that exercise. So let me begin with the GST. And let me ask you, it was supposed to be one India, one tax. As things are, and for whatever reasons that we will discuss over the next few minutes, it is not going to be one India, one tax. It's one India and almost 8 taxes. Have we compromised too much on the GST?
Yeah, see, let me say 3 things on this question. Yeah,
right.
First, remember that I'm delighted that the incidence of the tax is going to be down relative to today, right? Now, in the report that I wrote, if you recall, I said there would be pretty substantial compliance gains, right? And in some ways, the decision to opt for a lower headline incidence reflects the conviction that there will be compliance gains. So that if the incidence is going to be lower going forward, especially on the goods consumed by the poorer people, you're going to get both an equity benefit, but also all the fears about inflation should, I think, be now held to check, because I think now that fear, of course, we have to make sure that the tax decreases are passed on so that consumers actually benefit, but the inflation fears are now, I think, should subside. One, so that's overwhelmingly positive. Second, on this one India, one tax, one India, many taxes, I think that there are 2 standards against which you can measure that. The first standard is it an improvement on the current regime? And my honest assessment is that compared to today, it's going to be a huge improvement, even in complexity. If you look today at the excise rates, there are, I think if you read my report, there are, I think,
that's right,
12, 13, 14 excise
right.
rates. Similarly, on the service tax today, de facto, there are like 7 or 8 rates, if you take into account abatement and all of this. So relative to that, it's going to be an improvement. Okay, so that's also very positive. But if your standard is that we could have used this opportunity to clean up much more, I think there is probably too much complexity on that standard. But I think that if we can work on this on an ongoing basis, then I think over time we should try and clean up, and maybe we will be able to clean up this complexity as a gradual evolutionary process. Because remember,
and that is perhaps what the real unique GST will be.
No, and remember that, just to, since we're being candid here, I think we need to continually evolve the system on 2 fronts. Not just the complexity of the rates, but also the base. We need to bring in land and real estate, health, education, power, and petroleum, so on both fronts, the complexity front and the base expansion front, we need to do this.
So let me begin by talking to you then, just the last point that you made. When do we see that expansion happen? In realistic terms, it's taken us a decade to come where we have now. When do we see that expansion happen? When do we see more inclusion?
No, I think that, see, now this is something that now we have a GST council, we have this terrific intergovernmental process, right? And then, in principle, it can happen anytime. If they get together and say, look, our experience after 1 year is that there is leakage here, complexity here, they can always at any point choose to evolve the system. And I'm hoping that there will be that pressure at work on an ongoing basis.
So, you've been very candid in your assessment of Indian industry, and India Inc. has unitedly almost said unanimously that we hope rates will not be reviewed very frequently. There has to be certain amount of predictability and longevity to these rates. Do you essentially agree with that?
Well, it's a trade-off, right? I mean, if on the one hand you want predictability, but then, you know, predictable and complex is also has complexity. So you want to balance that. You want to have predictability, but also try and effect improvements that will substantively, you know, make this a better tax system.
Dr. Subramanian, you know, while most rates have been kept to where they were previously, you know, with a little bit of difference here and there, I'm a little surprised with what the council has done with hybrid cars, for instance, and that has really thrown the industry up in arms. Rates have gone up there by about 15-odd%. It's at 43% right now. It's 28. I mean, after the GST council. Is there scope for review? Because, you know, auto guy after auto guy, or ministers after minister, from a Nitin Gadkari to just everybody who we've been talking to, they all believe that there is a scope for a review there.
You see, I think that, in fact, one of the, you know, I think challenges of this process is that, you know, anyone whose rate has gone up is going to or thinks his rate is going to go up, any industry is going to complain. So this is part of the political challenge, is, you know, to try and explain why we've reduced where we have, why we've cleaned up where we have, why we haven't been able to clean up as much as we should have or could have. And that's part of the political challenge. So I think we're going to get these kind of issues raised, not just by one, but perhaps even by other industries. So I think there's a sense in which, you know, the political process has to take an overall view. You know, after all, remember, it's not over yet. June 3rd, we're going to have at least 5 or 6 more for, you know, very important sectors. At the end of that process, we have to take a considered view, because remember, there is going to be a lot of outcry saying, oh, you know, my tax has gone up, etc. So I think we need to take that holistic view on June 3rd.
So whether it's from cola to car makers, everybody has a view on the rates that they've been put under.
And they have the same view, cut my rate. You know,
exactly, everyone wants the rate lower. But
exactly.
hybrid cars is an aberration, so I guess, you know, they'll petition the government and they'll petition the finance ministry. I don't know how it works out. But because there are, you know, industries from cola to car makers who want a review, who are not comfortable with where they are. The cola guys say, what is the incentive for me to produce a low sugar drink? What is the incentive to innovate? I'm just asking you, from now to the 1st of July, will we perhaps see a lot of clamor, and in that sense, a lot of accommodation that the government will have to do? Because this is going to be a political exercise as much as a fiscal exercise.
I don't know. Let's wait till June 3rd, because that's when everything will be known fully. And then let's see what happens. And then, you know, there will always be some pushback. And I think it's going to depend upon how the government assesses how valid these claims are versus, you know, the larger objective of a GST. Let's wait till June 3rd for that assessment.
How confident are you of a consensus finally being reached on gold and also on things like beauties? Again, political hot potatoes, both of them. On the 3rd of June.
I'm glad I don't have to decide these rates. But I think that, you know, remember with gold that the big breakthrough happened on gold in the last budget. Remember that gold, the states were taxing at 1%, and then the center says we're going to impose a tax of 1%, right? I think the biggest opposition came at that stage because, you know, you had to come clean on your books. Now I think it should be less of a challenge, because, you know, once everyone has to show this on the books, I mean, raising rates then is just a matter of seeing, you know, I think that the trade-off on gold is going to be, look, something that people forget on this, you know, and this is a lesson I want to pass on to all viewers.
Right.
This is a GST. The final incidence of the tax is paid by the consumer.
That's right.
It's not paid by, you know, the producer in any way. It just gets passed on. So when you assess something like gold, and this is what we said in our report, you have to see who is consuming gold. And our analysis shows overwhelmingly that something like 90% of the gold is consumed probably by the top 10%. So gold in that sense is not a, you know, a common man's thing.
It's not an essential item.
Yeah. So I think therefore, you know, that's one perspective. But then that has to be balanced against the fact that this is one commodity where evasion can take place, you know, relatively easily. So I think that's going to be the kind of balancing act that the council will have to do going forward. But my sincere hope is that we won't create a new rate band, you know, to accommodate gold. I would much rather we accommodated it within the existing
ones.
Yeah.
You know, your supposition that this is not going to be inflationary is based on the fact that there will be benefits that will be passed on to the consumers, but we do also have an anti-profiteering mechanism to keep a check on that, which will look into the books of books of companies. Do you fear in some sense this is going to be very intrusive as far as Indian industry is concerned?
You see, I have a little bit less of a fear, because if rates are coming down, right, then the challenge will be to that the rate should be passed on. Not that, if everyone knows that rates are coming down, I think it's going to be very difficult for people to actually increase prices, right?
Yeah.
So I think that fear should subside. But I think we need to just know, as long as there's a lot of awareness about this anti-profiteering thing, I mean, I do think that this is a kind of as much of a symbolic thing, will be used very sparingly, and it should become an intrusive instrument for, going after people, indiscriminately.
Because we're talking about things candidly, I want to talk about the other elephant in the room, and that's NPAs. Has been one for a while. There's finally an ordinance, there's legislative legitimacy and all of that. But people turn around and say this is like a loaded gun that has been given to the RBI. The question is, who's going to pull the trigger? Will it be your friend Viral Acharya? Will it be Urjit Patel? I mean, who is really going to pull the trigger on this loaded gun that has been handed over to the central bank? And it's too much faith being reposed on that ordinance fixing things that are toxic assets.
See, now remember, I think before the ordinance was passed, the allegation was government is not doing enough, people are not doing enough. Now that, all parties have consulted and have, taken this very seriously and have, implemented taken this very decisive big action, which is, the ordinance. I think that now we have to give this a chance to work, to see how it pans out. So earlier the complaint was there's no gun. Now you're saying it's a loaded gun. There's no winning in this business, right? So let's see how it. So now the proof of the pudding is going to be, do we actually see resolution process going forward or not?
In your candid admission, is this going to resolve things? Be honest with me.
No, I mean, we have to. I mean, it's, as you said, it's a powerful instrument, and it could potentially work. But the proof is going to be what actually happens.
In some sense, are you undermining the commercial banks, because this should have been ideally a commercial decision? It was not taken for various reasons, institutional activism, bureaucrats being pulled up. But do you believe this is, after all, a bank's decision? I mean, why should the central bank or the government at large sit down and decide what the haircut will be? Why should the MD or the EDs of banks not decide that?
Well, you answered the question yourself. I mean, the point is that we do have a situation where public sector officials find it very, very, very difficult to take these decisions. And that's a first order fact. So the question is, so we can't wish away this reality. We have to work around the reality. And that's why the measures have been taken as they have.
So I'm going to ask you one last question on NPA before I move on. Do you believe the whole mechanism, overriding powers to the RBI, banks being given more teeth, is this going to be counterproductive to risk appetite? I mean, what about the promoters who would want to take risks? Isn't this counterproductive? Because it's not going to be you, but it's almost like a big brotherly watch on issues that can go wrong. And sometimes those issues are out of your control, aren't they?
No, I think that, remember, you would hope that the way this process would work is that, where promoters were responsible, they'll have to pay a price and either lose their stake or lose control. And in other cases, we may have situations where, honest mistakes were made in the past, have to be, addressed accordingly. But it's going to be up to the process that's being set up to actually be able to distinguish those cases and move forward. So that's precisely why we have a process.
So you don't believe this is going to at all dent or compromise the risk appetite that promoters or Indian industry should be taking?
I think if it's done correctly, I mean, if anything, I think the allegation is that under the status quo, the incentives have been badly affected going forward. So if we get a process that works well, then I don't see any reason why, a risk appetite should be, if the risk appetite has been determined more by, judicial activism and all of that, that's what's been denting, this. And if you can move beyond that, great.
Some months have passed, and so it's only right that I speak to you candidly about demonetization as well. Your predecessor had an adverse view on this. His predecessor has a very, very negative view on this. I'm referring to Kaushik Basu. At the end of these months that have passed, do you believe demonetization has achieved what it set out to achieve?
In the case of certainly the long-term benefits, we had set out some clear markers in terms of, what would constitute success, more taxpayers, more digitalization, reduction in the cash, use of cash. And these are all things we are going to be able to monitor over time. And And remember, and this is not by any means ducking the question, these are things that will happen over a period of time. So the assessment of this will have to be continual and over time, not immediate. And so we have to be making these assessments going forward.
Can I get the record straight? Were you consulted on demonetization? You're one of the most, I would say one of the most candid, one of the most informed voices on Indian economy. Were you consulted on demonetization? No,
you see, I have a very good answer to this question, which is that, why do you want to, deprive me of, material for my, memoirs, which I will write 15 years down the road or 20 years down the road.
I was hoping to take some part out of that right now.
Okay. It's also not an important question at all, yeah.
Sir, you're not just the Chief Economic Advisor here. You've spent a considerable amount of time overseas. I think you have a whole host of friends who've criticized this, whether this is Larry Summers or a Ken Rogoff or a Kaushik Basu. I mean, some very important voices have criticized this. If you were not the Chief Economic Advisor, would your opinion of demonetization be the same as it is today?
No, that's a good question. It's a fair question. Before I answer, let me say one thing about demonetization. You did ask me, right?
Right.
That I think that one of the things that I've been genuinely, surprised and humbled by is, that, see, I'm not saying that, there weren't short-term costs. I'm not saying that there were also some costs on the formal and the informal sector. But I have genuinely been humbled by the fact that relative to the scale of the action that was taken, how relatively muted the impact on the economy has been. And this is something that, one has to study over time. Now, your second question, I think to some extent, people's views on things may change depending upon where they're sitting, because the constraints and roles are very different. Even my predecessor's predecessor, when he was at the World Bank, he had certain views, and now, of course, and he's a free, person to say that. So I think it's willing. Everyone should be free to express their opinion. But you can't get over the fact that people's opinions to some extent will be shaped
determined by where they sit.
Where they're sitting, yeah. Because it's not because people want to dissemble or hide, but there are certain responsibilities and things you have depending upon where you're sitting. Yeah.
I want to just take the focus away from the whole fiscal angle and what's happening in North Block onto something that you have said, and rightly so. We've overachieved targets on inflation. Our deficits are under control. Growth is just about chugging along, picking up, many would say. And yet, both fiscal and monetary policy continue to be very tight. In fact, to an extent, some people say there should be a tighter monetary policy regime.
Who are these people? I'd like to know.
There are lots of them, and you know who I'm talking about.
Okay.
But are you disappointed with how tight the monetary regime has been? And do you believe there is scope for a looser monetary regime?
See, first of all, these are decisions,
I understand, it's completely autonomous, but as an economist, you can have a view.
I have made my views clear in the recent V.K.R. Rao Memorial Lecture that I gave.
That's right, yes.
I do think that, the RBI has done a tremendous job on inflation control, and congratulations, because it's really, we have inflation under 3%. I think the inflation outlook is also relatively benign. I think that, if you look at the growth picture as well, that, I think the economy could do with some, both fiscal and monetary policy support. And so I think the important thing for me is that all, agents, parts of government, decision makers in government, whether it's RBI or a government, that we have the full range of facts and views, and then we make decisions based on that. And I think in this case, I have expressed the view that certainly there is a plausible case that, inflation is under control and activity is not as strong as it should be. So you could have a range of opinion on where monetary policy could be.
So what is more disappointing, the fact that there's been status quo on interest rates, or the fact that there's been a change in stance from accommodative to neutral? Because if you look at credit growth, it's at a historic low. So people will believe that lower rates will boost demand. That's not happening. What is more concerning for you?
No, for me, the important thing is that, we have the range of opinion, and, policymakers base their decision based on that range of opinion, and to be challenged if that's not consistent with the evidence and the data.
Talking about range of opinion, are you, I mean, disappointment perhaps is the wrong word, but are you let down by the fact that the whole idea of a monetary policy committee was that there will be growth warriors and there will be inflation hawks and there will be a mixing of views? But policy after policy, when you read the minutes of the MPC meeting, it's almost everybody is speaking in the same voice and everybody seems to be an inflation hawk right now.
Yeah,
is that puzzling for you? Because I know a lot of your memorial lecture came from there.
You know, I think that I certainly it's a striking fact. It's not something that one would have expected ex ante. And as I said, in the lecture, the joke about economists is that if you put 3 economists in a room, you get 4 views. In this case, when we have lots of economists and yet we get only 1 view, it is interesting. I don't know whether it's specific to the MPC, but it is to me a little bit interesting. Yeah.
If I may just stretch that argument a little to what you said there isn't this insufficient criticism and people are insufficiently critical and they keep changing stance and endorse a government's view. Why do you think that's happening? Is there a fear psychosis in the minds of corporates and institutions even like the RBI to toe the government line, to toe the official state line?
Yeah, I think that's a question that you should ask them as to why they do it.
You raised the point, so I'm asking you.
Yeah, I think there could be, there is, I don't think this is probably true always in most countries, nothing peculiar to India. But I think, and maybe some of it, you can't get around. So I think the best way out of it is to get more kind of independent academic voices out there, who have this certain distance, arm's length from, the apparatus of power, as I called it. Because, I mean, that too is a structural feature. There will be people who are close to the apparatus of power, so we need to build countervailing voices who are not so dependent upon the apparatus of power. And that's how you get a kind of wide variety of opinion.
And what would you attribute the fact that a lot of very expert voices, eminent people go out there and bend backwards to toe a government line? They have a certain opinion once, and you're right when you say that during demonetization, inflation was going to be brought down, there was going to be so much liquidity in the system, and yet when status quo was maintained, everybody lauded it. I mean, what explains that?
No, but I mean, my job is to pose the question. I would like others to answer it, You begin
a public debate, and you want the rest of them to join in.
Yeah, exactly. And that's happening, by the way. So I'm very pleased by that, actually.
Do you believe there is this sense of fear in the minds of opinion makers? They don't want to be candid. There's a price to being candid.
I don't really know how this works out. And also because, remember, these are questions that I think one has to have a slight perspective and comparative perspective, how is it in other countries, how is it in other, spheres. Remember, to me the interesting thing is this, which I pointed out, if you take something like, WTO policy or trade policy or, fertilizer policy or whatever, right, or social policy, there is much more diversity of opinion. So it's not something...
It's only macroeconomic policy.
Yeah, there's something about macro... I mean, that's the question I'm posing. So it's not generally, it's not because of, government or industry or whatever or power, but it seems to be more specific to macroeconomics than it is, in other spheres of policy making. There does seem to be much more vigorous debate.
I know your present position where you sit will not make you laud what Moody's has done with China, but it looks like you have an influence outside of India as well. Do you stand vindicated with this downgrade?
See, first of all, I think this is nothing, has nothing to do with the country China or India.
I understand.
All countries have to do well. I think vindication is perhaps too strong a word, but I do think that raising these issues from time to time strongly and vocally is important, because it's part of, going back to what I said, it's part of challenging, because everyone needs to be challenged. The credit rating agencies need to be challenged too. And so in that sense, to the extent that, we challenge them, to the extent that they have to respond, I think this part of what, not just national but international public policy making should be about.
When you say that credit rating agencies have to be challenged, there is some amount of truth and there's some amount of favor that you find with a whole host of opinion makers and people and commentators out there. But a lot of them also throw this back at India, the credibility of our data. I mean, I know our series have been revised and we will perhaps get things closer to reality, but credibility of Indian macro data is a big cause of concern for a whole host of people. I mean, I'm sure as an opinion maker it was a cause of concern for you as well. Do you look at that differently while being in the government?
No, I think, look, I think that all countries need to make sure the data, both the process, the methodology, and the outcomes are, unimpeachable integrity, and also methodologically, technically very robust. I've always maintained that in the Indian case, there's no question that our systems and our people who produce them are of unimpeachable integrity. But there will always be technological and methodological issues which we have to work through, and it's an ongoing process. For example, I think the IIP and the WPI data that have come out, there are significant improvements upon what went previously, and we have to keep doing this all the time. This is a process. It's like Alice in Wonderland. You have to run to stay in the same place, and we have to do this on an ongoing basis.
Okay, a last question then, and this has to do with what's happening in the world around us. There is a lot of protectionist voices that are coming in. There is a lot of impact it's having on our Indian IT industry, for instance, huge layoffs that we've seen. Jobs, I think, continue to be the big red in this government report card, and add to this the layoffs that are coming in IT. How grim is that part of the whole situation?
I think you should be careful about saying red in this report card, in this government
report card.
There's
not enough job creation. Are you going to deny that?
I don't know how, and I'm not, I'm going to be very honest with you in saying that I don't think we really know the employment situation very well, because we don't know, we don't have enough data, quality data, to be able to come to very strong conclusions about, whether unemployment has gone up or come down, employment has gone up. I think that that's an area where we have to improve our data.
You've come out with some very innovative things in your economic surveys over the last few years, whether it's the universal basic income and other such innovative ideas like that. In the last few years that you've been here, is there political appetite for reforms like that?
Yeah, I think that one of the real pleasures of this job or whatever has been that when you produce ideas, they are taken seriously. You see, because I've always been of the view that people like me, advisors or whatever, their job is to come up with ideas and to see to try and push the envelope in terms of what can be done. I don't think that we should have, people like me should have any personal ego or vanity about saying, oh my God, I produced an idea, it hasn't been implemented, therefore I've been a failure.
The idea is to start an idea and let a public discourse follow.
And remember, in democratic politics, with all the constraints, the process of translation from ideas to policy and implementation is a long drawn out one, and therefore the fact that there is a receptive audience both within and outside government is what makes this job so interesting and challenging at the same time.
And we do hope you continue to have the fun. Thank you very much for speaking to us.
Supriya, thanks.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/ETNow.